Hello, hello. We are back. We are back.
It's been a while. We're glad to be back. Summer's always hectic for us, and we're excited to talk about the conclusion.
The conclusion of the book, aka Chapter 12.
Yeah.
The conclusion. We just want to say right out the gate that this is not going to be the last episode that we record on the Dawn of Everything. Actually, far be it from us to bring this to an abrupt end.
Abrupt. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
We're going to have a guest on in just a little bit. We're going to record with him in a couple of weeks, and we're going to bring on, an actual Graeber scholar.
That's right.
To talk about some big picture stuff about what the book helps us do and to see and everything with somebody who really appreciates what it's doing. And so we're very much looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And we'll probably share some parting thoughts about the Dawn of Everything on that episode too.
Mm-hmm.
But this time we're gonna try and be pretty
Focused
on talking about what is in this chapter.
Yes.
And not so much share our own final thoughts about the Dawn of Everything.
Right. That being said, this is the conclusion.
Yeah,
So-
they're sharing their final thoughts. So
They're sharing their final thoughts.
We're going to be in conversation with those.
Right. And
Yeah.
also, just to place everyone in the context of the book, in this conclusion, the Davids are both reviewing many of the points that they brought up along the way in the other 11 chapters,
Mm-hmm.
but they are bringing in a few new ideas or elaborating on some new ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we will be spending a little bit more time on those.
How did we get
Parts.
stuck?
Yes. So as part of the review, they remind us of the larger context within which the book exists, which is the body of work that it could be called social theory.
Social theory writ large.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they remind us that there are two dominant strains of thought within social theory, or at least the part they're going to be dealing with. And that, but so anyway, we'll get more to that in a moment. But the two strains of thought they're talking about are the idea that humans lived fairly free, and then at a certain point came into states of confinement or less liberty and more constraint. Everywhere we're in chains. When did that happen? So that would, of course, be the
Yes.
Rousseauian thread.
Our so-called chains.
Our so-called chains.
Yes.
And the other thread is, or the other dominant framework is that humans are actually inherently selfish and greedy, and therefore there was never a time in which we weren't dominating each other, or competing, and working to out-maneuver our fellow humans.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the Hobbesian
Yes.
strain.
Right.
Now, what the Davids do here that is new is propose that all of this is actually conservative, that there's not like a liberal strain, which is the Rousseauian one, and a conservative strain that is the Hobbesian thread, but they are both actually somewhat conservative.
Yeah, which you might remember actually from chapter 1, where they were very hard on the Rousseauian view.
That's true.
And they came right out the gates in chapter 1 being like, surprise, we don't think Rousseau is a hero.
Right.
And so this is actually kind of coming full circle
Mm-hmm.
in some ways back around to that.
So I'm not trying to say that they are making these equally conservative.
Yeah.
But they acknowledge that most people prefer the Rousseauian narrative if they have to choose between the two, because it means we're not evil.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah.
they want to point out that when you frame things in such a way that, when you frame history in such a way that there was a point in which a development of a new technology, a development of a new social arrangement, or whatever the fall might be,
Mm-hmm.
agriculture, language, insert your favorite narrative here for how we fell and why,
Yeah.
or a combination of them. Abstract thinking, that's one sometimes people put forward.
Yeah.
Whatever the fall is, it's hard for us to imagine going back. And if our freedom only existed before that development, then we are still just as constrained as if we were inherently prone to domination and incapable of doing otherwise.
Yeah, they accuse Rousseau of like postulating a primordial innocence for humanity, and that developments that he traced entailed like a loss of innocence, basically, and a fall into domination, private property, all of these things. And innocence lost cannot be regained. Really. Right. And so it's like a one-way. It's a one-way transit. In short, that's what they would think is the conservatism inherent in Rousseau.
Yes.
Even though the short version is that like Hobbes is the right-wing view and Rousseau is the left-wing view, you know, but they want to move beyond that simplistic dichotomy and say that even us on the left can do better than Rousseau. So yeah, I mean, they really want us to understand in these opening moves of the conclusion here how hard they think it is to think better, to think more expansively, to have a more expansive imagination about human possibility, and to understand that what they're trying to do is like an uphill battle against the inherent limitations and conservatism of social theory in general, including anthropology. You know, and they have a couple different ways of describing that conservatism. You know, for one thing, they assert that social theory was basically founded by conservatives, by conservative traditionalists who were seizing upon the failure of the Enlightenment revolutions, like the American and the French Revolution, to actually meaningfully deliver on their promises, to argue that we shouldn't even be trying to make revolutions in the first place, you know? And so actually this was new to me. I didn't realize that some of the earliest social theorists were these people who tried to show that Enlightenment ideas about liberty and equality were just flying in the face of the basic human needs for order and tradition and even maybe hierarchy. So anyway, yes, the tone was set early on in social theory by some prominent conservative thinkers. They don't mention Marx and Engels, who were like right there kind of at the beginning of social theory too. I mean, I get why, because they're complicated. They were also critics of the Enlightenment revolutions, but critics in the sense that they didn't think they went far enough, and they also thought that they were basically a tool of the bourgeois merchant class in order to rise to power over the monarchy instead of actually being about freeing the mass of humanity. So they were also critics of the Enlightenment, but not in a conservative way, because they were also revolutionaries. But anyway, they leave Marx and Engels off to the side, and all of their ilk, you know, and the people who they were in conversation with and stuff. They leave them off to the side.
Which is a gigantic lineage. Of social theory. Just really. To say. But anyway, the Davids are not going to talk about that because they're after a simpler story for this part, and they are engaging more with the I would say liberal and right wing, meaning not leftist, kind of like what we're dealing with in the United States, like those two poles instead of the third pole. Yeah,
they kind of want to say, social theory is mostly written by people who want to tell us why we can't be free.
Exactly. Right. Right.
And Marx and Engels had some theories about why we're not free and what are the nature of our chains, but also how we could get free.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, they follow this thread, not just from the origins of social theory, but right into contemporary anthropology. And talk about how, 20th century anthropology was also a lot about describing the people who were studied as bound in traditional ways of being.
Right. As existing in an eternal present.
Yeah, because the question here is, are you free to remake the social world? Can we make history? Do people make history?
Right.
Or something else? Do people make history, or does history just make the people? What kind of agency is possible, right? And they definitely take anthropology to task, especially historical anthropology, who studied the indigenous peoples of the world, maybe primarily, and depicted those people as having inhabited an eternal present, like a timeless way of being that had been unchanging for like countless generations back into the past, right? And that we still, even lay people, might talk about like traditional cultures, like the traditional cultures of the world. And the implication is that these are people who've like been one way, more or less. Or if change has happened, if like social change has happened in the course of their cultural history, it's happened only slowly and incrementally. And they do some pretty interesting accounting for this. Like one thing that they mention in just a paragraph is that they talk about how like part of why that is, like why anthropology described people in that way, has to do with colonialism and how colonialism basically froze the conquered people in their place.
To keep them subjugated.
In order to keep them subjugated, like it was in the interest of the colonizers to sort of just to freeze them and sort of be like, okay, so this is how you are. These are your power structure, and we're going to have a relationship with these chiefs or leaders, and that's how they're going to interact with the colonial apparatus and stuff. And then anthropologists like went in to study these people who were basically being prevented from having meaningful political evolution or changes and stuff by the colonial apparatus. So it's like understandable that the anthropologists described people who were just going through the yearly rounds of the rituals and, you know, the food production, and everything just seemed very cyclical and set in place.
Right. I do just want to note here that, of course, there's a long history of forced assimilation and erasure as well.
Yeah. Forced assimilation would be another strategy that colonization would sometimes employ, where people were not allowed to enact their traditional ways, but were forced to give them up.
So forced assimilation would be denial of and erasure of culture, which is a strategy. And then the other strategy would be like freezing in time, not allowing much change so that people are more controllable, so that you can go ahead and nip in the bud any kind of political resistance and keep a certain power dynamic with the colonized peoples. Right.
Yeah. No, it's good to point out that like what they're talking about here is not how it always has been under colonization by any means. But yeah, one thing that, you know, we haven't given much space to this on the podcast, but it has come up actually throughout the book. And I know that this is something that David Graeber has spoken out about outside of this book, that anthropology, even otherwise progressive anthropology, does a disservice to people when it portrays them as living in like almost a different reality than Western modern assimilated people can understand. When it portrays them as living in a different kind of experience of time, or as is the case with what's called the ontological turn, as in like incommensurable ontologies, like whole different realities. Graeber has some really sophisticated arguments against these ways of thinking, but fundamentally, I think a lot of it comes back to what he sees are the political implications of whether or not we see people as being able to make history, you know, to be able to have agency, to be able to make change in their worlds, to be able to revolt, to adapt,
reconfigure,
you know, to reconfigure, to do all these things. And it's at this point that they bring in Mircea Eliade, actually, as somebody who really brings this opposition, you know, kind of to a head.
Whew. Boy, I could talk about this guy for the whole episode. So I'm going to try to keep this brief here. Have we talked about Eliade yet this season?
I don't know if we've talked about him this season. I've had it, because this is a very memorable part of the book to me, so I've had it like in my sights this whole time, but I think this is it. This is now.
Yeah, I've been thinking about him a lot for a while now, and I too, this was a memorable part of the book when I first read it as well. Mircea Eliade is a Romanian academic. I mean, I think he's considered the founding father of religious studies
Yeah, he's definitely a founder of religious studies and an anthropologist.
He's also an anthropologist. He did do some ethnographies.
And he's a huge figure. Like, his works were read outside of the discipline. Mm-hmm. When I was in college, I had a book of his called Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy on my bookshelf.
Yeah, I mean,
very influential.
People who are not college students have his books on their shelves. Yeah. He's very widely read. He eventually immigrated to the United States, lived in Chicago, was a professor at the University of Chicago for a very long time. And so many people who are important writers in the field of religious studies and anthropology studied with him at some point, because when he was teaching there. Yeah. So just to say that he's a monumental figure, definitely known outside of his field, and extremely influential in the way that lay people understand religion and religious experience, right? I would say. Mm-hmm. One of his famous books
and the way religion functions within cultures and stuff. Yeah.
One of his famous books is called The Myth of the Eternal Return.
Yeah, that's right.
And we won't go into that, but it does.
It's very relevant.
It's relevant here because the Davids are bringing in Eliade here because he had a system of thinking of human consciousness and development and social structure even as being tied to conceptions and perceptions of time.
It's almost ontological.
Yes.
Where like they live in a different kind of time.
Absolutely. I think he's foundational to that.
Yeah.
To that body of work.
I think it's like it goes beyond what they believe. It's like sort of
and probably a lot of people listening to this might think this as well, that like how we perceive of time changes how we think, and how we perceive the world affects our brain structure and vice versa, so, and how we interact with our world and with each other. He identified two primary ways of relating to time. One is cyclical time, which is mythic time, and that's where the eternal return comes in, which is that everything has already happened. We're just going through these cycles over and over again. He was an early Western scholar. I'm assuming he'll count as a Western scholar of India and of Hinduism and yoga. And he wrote one of the first books in the West on yoga, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Anyway, that was his field work. He went there when he was very young and did that. But he saw cyclical time, which he had studied in India, and saw as in practice there and affecting the way people live in the world.
Right.
So as being the way people tend to exist until a certain point in our collective history, and that most of the important events have already happened. Fire was discovered, war was discovered, agriculture was discovered, and we all do different humans who are living in cyclical time will have rituals that move through the wheel of the year and reiterate and reinforce those discoveries, but that nothing new is happening.
Right.
There's nothing new under the sun, that idea. He juxtaposes that cyclical time with linear time, which he sees as a ultimately negative Western development that begins with Judaism and moves through the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, so he does have this bias, but I think that y'all can kind of understand what this opposition consists of, right? Because linear time is where you can have history, right? Like novel events where new things are happening, right? At every turn, and then cyclical time, like Janet said, is just this like repetition of the familiar going through the rounds, right? And, when I hear this, I can relate to both.
Sure.
Like, obviously, we go through a cycle of the seasons and there's holidays and we repeat things and we have different observances and we have different, it feels to me like we live in cyclical time and linear time, right? Like both of these are aspects.
Right.
But Eliade, not only did he make this opposition, but he was like a traditionalist. And so, he goes beyond what we're talking about here about anthropologists that sort of consign traditional peoples to cyclical time where there's no novelty and it's impossible to make history. Eliade not only did that, but he also was like, and that's where we should be.
Right.
He thought that making history, that entering linear time was a degeneration.
Right.
set us on the wrong path.
Right.
And in his anti-Semitic way, he identified that, like you said, with
the Abrahamic faiths. Although I think probably other historians of religion might think that worldview actually goes back to Zoroastrianism.
What we failed to say, in case you don't know, Eliade, he was a student at the time of the rise of fascism.
Yes.
He was caught up in the rise of fascism and was in sympathy with a lot of their ideas. And so it's not surprising that he put a anti-Semitic turn on the theories that he was developing.
Yeah, for sure. We can link in the show notes, but I read a whole book on his fascist past and how it was buried, and how one of his students, Culiano, was in the midst of translating some text that exposed just how active he was in the Iron Guard, the Romanian militant fascist arm.
Right.
And Culiano was famously executed in the bathroom at the University of Chicago. We can share notes to that, but I just want to say that there's a lot of whitewashing of Eliade's actual fascist activity. Yeah. And that for a very long time, people have just been like, oh, he was just adjacent. But that seems to not be the case, just to say here. But yes, his conception of linear time and seeing it as degeneration and seeing it as absolutely tied to Abrahamic faith, specifically Judaism. His theory of mythic sacred time, which is always cycling through the seasons, living in a sort of eternal present, is still seen, which is, when we were talking about the anthropology, there's so many examples we can think of that are people sort of knowingly or unknowingly reinforcing that idea.
Yeah, they're bringing him in here as an example of an extremely influential anthropologist, and as an example of this widespread idea that it's normal for people to not live in history. It's normal, and like in the case of Eliade, also like preferable.
Preferable, right.
To not live in history, to not be making history. And I mean, I think that one of the things that's powerful about bringing Eliade in here and talking about what his views are is that it unearths the potential sympathies that some of us might have, even if we're not fascists, for this way of looking at the world, right? Of like looking back at what we've been told are more traditional times, like an older way of being, and idealizing that, maybe. When we could just have this kind of stability of culture where it was just our lot to like roll through the cycles, and not have to be in goddamned history all the time.
Right.
And that there is like, even among non-fascists, you can encounter a certain sympathy and maybe even idealization of that form of life, which is part of what the Davids are talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one thing that has been widely and hotly debated around Eliade's work is it inherently fascist?
Yeah.
Is there something about fascist about, was it not only that he hung out with and was a baby fascist,
right?
But also that, is there something fascist in that whole framework? And they're saying, yeah, there probably is.
Yeah, or at least conservative.
Conservative, right.
Or at least conservative.
And then it doesn't allow for agency or change. And it also reminds me of how a lot of indigenous scholars and thinkers will criticize settler tendency to want to freeze them in place and freeze indigenous thought as being like an oral tradition or as being like a very specific way of relating to the world that doesn't allow them to exist in the current moment.
Yeah, totally, yes.
And I think that we see a lot of people doing that today, people who probably identify as progressives, who identify as people who want to keep indigenous lifeways alive. But often when those people are settlers, they're very attached to this frozen concept of indigeneity.
Right.
And I think that we need to keep that in mind. So being careful not to be keeping various peoples we might be interested in frozen, but also frozen in time and not allowed to change or be part of the current moment, denying them agency.
Right.
But we also need to be careful of the idealization of the past that can happen when we're into mythic time, into the idea of sacred time, which can be a doorway to fascism or Nazism even in some cases. There's a reason why certain kinds of Nazis in the occult world will actually recruit at pagan events.
Yeah, right.
Because there are people there who are really interested in traditional ways and want to go back there and are very anti-modern. And those anti-modern sentiments are often part of various authoritarian, especially white supremacist, ways of moving through the world, even though there are interesting parts of fascism, actually in Italian fascism, that was also into the future, you know?
Yeah, true, right. Yeah.
It's still important to know that traditionalism and idealization of the past is often part of a conservative agenda.
So those are some ways that the Davids think that they are trying to work within inherently conservative field, you know? And what we just talked about is kind of interesting because it's all pretty novel. It's like they haven't talked about those aspects of what they're trying to counteract yet in the book. But also in the conclusion here, they do kind of go back over some of the other popular ideas in social theory that they have already spent a lot of time trying to debunk.
Right.
You know, so we do get a revisiting of their arguments against the various forms of like what they would see as determinisms that people use to ideologically take away our freedom. You know, like saying that because we are agricultural, we can't be free like we were before we were agricultural, or because we live in cities, or because we live in big populations. The overarching sense that they give of all of this, which really comes into sharp relief here in the conclusion, is that as far as all of these things go, they just want to say that people just played. People played around with all of this stuff. They played with living in cities. They played with different social forms. They played with having kings. They played with having crops. They played even with having police. And that even though what they were playing with was stuff that could easily become oppressive or enable oppressive social structures in the right context or the wrong context, that for a long time we were just free to play with these things.
Yeah, I know that we've talked about this before. I don't love the use of the word play. I understand what they're trying to do, and they're trying to just emphasize the creativity and the trying stuff out, the experimentation that they see as being a common denominator in human history. And while I mentioned that, I just want to go back briefly to the eternal present that we were just talking about with Eliade, because in case it wasn't clear, the Davids are arguing that humans have always had agency, always had history. We're always making things happen.
Yeah.
You know, and the way they see that as playing out is in this like form of constant experimentation, trying out new things, working with others to develop new technologies, like more of a collective works over individual works of greatness, like working on like a culture of experimentation that they see as being common in many points in history.
Yeah.
You know, and this as a foil to sort of like the individual genius scientist hero guy.
Yeah.
You know, that's part of the point.
Right.
And I think part of what they're doing when they talk about play is emphasize collectivity.
Yeah,
a bit,
it feels like it.
You know, and whether or not that's successful, I'm not sure. But I do think that's part of what it's about, the group doing things together.
Right.
You know?
Right. There is something in there where, I mean, I wonder sometimes, because like, here's an example of the kind of thing that they want to say. They want to say, people didn't invent cultivated crops. People didn't invent agriculture because there was a need to scale up population and settlements. It wasn't instrumental in that way. Like, we need to invent this so that this can happen. That would be a context for invention that's more familiar to us now.
Right.
You know, where like, we need to invent an energy source that can replace the fossil fuels. Or something, right?
Right.
We
need to make some solid jet fuel.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to invent the fucking bomb before the Germans do or whatever. They want to say that like invention just kind of happened without it being instrumental necessarily. In a lot of these contexts, like people just played around with growing stuff. And then once that was there, once people were growing crops, then agriculture could be instrumentalized later. And it was instrumentalized later, you know, right? So like rulers then like appropriated agriculture to, you know, grow cities and do this shit with, right? Or whatever, right? And I mean, I do wonder sometimes, although I think that they're right about that, I'm convinced, you know, that agriculture was not invented to feed growing populations in like a, we need this for this reason type of way. But I'm less sure what is so game-changing about seeing it in the way that they're proposing. How does it change our view of history to say people didn't invent agriculture in order to grow cities? They just invented agriculture as a form of just play and creativity. And it was then harnessed to the task of growing cities.
Right, because either way, there can still be a linear element or progressive element.
Yeah, I mean, it's just how things play out or something. Anyway, we don't have to answer that question really, but I mean, you know, okay, so like one way to answer it is that by changing the perspective, we are encouraged to think about the span of time before agriculture was harnessed to the growth of cities and the growth of empire. Right. And so, I mean, I think, okay, so maybe I do have the answer. I think that is what they're doing, is that they're not denying that agriculture would be used in this way, but they feel like it's very important to say that people didn't make it for that reason. I guess they're preserving this sense of just the prolific creativity of people to invent. And it's very important to them to remind us that, especially in the context of agriculture, it was probably the women who were doing the inventing, and to imagine a more free time when we could have agriculture without empire.
Right. Well, also part of the point of the book, I think, is to try to train us to look into the lacuna, into the holes in history and prehistory. And that instead of looking at like the pyramids, the high points, the obvious signs of empire, the monoliths, all of the different large lasting things, that we also learn to look for the spaces when these other bursts of creativity were happening that don't stand the test of time in that way, but actually are as monumental as the monolithic structures.
Right. Like they might get eclipsed by the like onrush of history and for some other reason or whatever, but they were real while they existed. And yeah, by slowing down and looking in, you know, what is typically called the transitional parts of history, we can actually see where there's cracks or like where there's space, and not just space for other constellations of being or whatever, other configurations, but we can see the evidence of them. And that these are part of like the reservoir of possibility that we have to draw on, potentially.
It's funny that you say constellations, because when I think about that project of the book, I often think about the night sky and the implication to the night sky for the universe in general, in that, you know, it was very recent that people, the physicists and lay people now, understood how much of the universe is made of dark matter, of that which is not visible, how much of the mass of the cosmos is the dark parts, the holes, because they're not holes, you know, they're actually dense.
Right.
And
there's stuff there.
And these holes, I'm using scare quotes as I do when you can't see me. These holes in the historic record are actually dense and full of life, full of events of various kinds.
Right.
You know, this is the dark matter. This is the dense dark matter that is actually the essence of our lives.
Like the use of steam engines to make temple doors appear to open of their own accord.
I love that.
By the Greeks. Yeah. This is like a passing mention in the chapter.
Yes.
But they're like, the Greeks famously, and I hadn't heard of this, but invented the steam engine. I don't know if they were the first to invent the steam engine, but in the context of their culture, they invented steam engines in order just to do this trick where they could make it look like temple doors opened by magic.
Amazing. Right.
To create a special effect.
Right.
Like basically.
Yeah.
You know?
And
they talk about gunpowder being invented for fireworks.
yes.
And everything. And yeah, it's very meaningful to them that the uses to which we normally think of these things being put were not the original uses.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Right.
Yeah. As maybe another kind of traditionalism.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, we need to go back to when gunpowder was just for fireworks.
Right. Right.
Before the fall.
Yeah. Although being anti-fireworks is such a popular opinion right now that maybe that's not even good enough for a lot of people.
Before
I
don't know what to do then. I give up.
Right.
No.
Yeah. It's a lonely time to be a fan of fireworks. I gotta say that.
True.
All right, let's reel it back in. They review the various ways that people have theorized that we went off the rails in this project of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, let's not frame it that way. Instead, let's think about what did we have going for us before? What was life like for people who were not stuck in their situation?
Yeah, and this is the beginning of the Davids offering what they think is a better way to think about all of this. A better way to think about what went wrong.
Mm-hmm. And then they bring up once again the three freedoms. When they look at the peoples in various points in history and prehistory who seem to have things better than we have today, they identify three freedoms, which are the freedom to move around, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to reconfigure or recreate the social structure. So now they're back to the question, if those are the three freedoms, which we clearly don't have now,
mm-hmm.
how did we get into this place that we don't have access to those freedoms? Because you need to have at least you have to have the first two to have the last one.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't move around and if you can't disobey, it's much harder to recreate your social order.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to give a little quick window into how this works, what they want to say is that as long as these three freedoms were in place, then the stakes for all of this potentially kind of toxic activity are just much lower. Like if you have a king and the king can give commands or something, right? I mean, this is literally what they're saying. They're in the Upper Paleolithic, you see people having these kings, it looks like, but they continue on and say, but we know that people had the freedom to disobey these kings. They had the freedom to just leave and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the third freedom, which was just to live a different way. And so therefore, there was no real risk that calling someone a king
mm-hmm.
would then come back on you to make you unfree.
Mm-hmm. Because
people could still enjoy these basic freedoms that enabled them to just escape any kind of social context
mm-hmm.
that they found undesirable. Right. So this is how the Davids want to look at things differently. They don't want to say that people collaborated to enforce, equality or egalitarian relations or something like that. They want to say that all kinds of social experiments, including hierarchical ones and all kinds of things, could bubble up. But as long as the freedoms were intact, we were not stuck. Mm-hmm. in any kind of social relation, at least not for very long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was just more fluidity in the capacity to dissolve and coagulate and dissolve and coagulate. And then at a certain point, there was no longer capacity for dissolution.
One thing that just on the three freedoms before we go on from that is that they skirt the question of what makes the three freedoms possible.
Mm-hmm.
They do say that the first two freedoms make the third freedom possible. Right. That you need to have the ability to disobey and to move
mm-hmm.
to be able to recreate a social world.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes the freedom to disobey and the freedom to move possible? Since these are the fundamental freedoms, it's a very alive question.
Right.
Okay, if this is what keeps us free, then when do we get to have those?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, this ties into something they talk about later in the chapter, which are the theories of anthropologist and poet Franz Steiner, who posited that hospitality and a general agreement around care for strangers, welcoming of strangers, asylum, all of these different collective ideas about how to deal with people walking around or moving around in the world.
Yeah.
Are foundational for freedom.
Right. Yeah. Right. Because that's part of being able to move.
Yes.
Is to be able to expect to be taken in.
Right.
In another place.
Right. And I know they definitely point to that with Hopewell and the clan system in general on Turtle Island as being an important part of the freedoms people experienced here.
Right.
Before conquest.
Yeah, so that's an example of what makes it possible, what makes one of the freedoms possible.
Yeah, hospitality, a culture of hospitality, care for strangers. And sometimes that would be through a kinship network.
Right.
But it might also just be through the idea that you help people when you see them. And that's very common in many cultures around the world.
Right.
Increasingly uncommon here on Turtle Island, which we can talk about that later too. But it's interesting. When I read this part, I was just like, wow. Seeing a lot of the rhetoric against immigration, a lot of the rhetoric against poor people, in general, unhoused people, the way that increasingly punitive ways of dealing with the unhoused populations in the U.S., like all of that is the opposite of hospitality and means it's less freedom for everyone.
Right.
If you can't live outside, if you can't move around and travel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, I was thinking of immigration in this part where they're talking about, like, one of the case studies in the conclusion here that they take up a little bit of space elucidating. It's one of the chunks of sort of new thought that is happening in here, where, although they are revisiting something that they talked about in the cities chapter, it has to do with Sumeria, right? Sumeria and the Sumerian temple factories. Right? Because part of this story, you might recall, is that the first factories, the first industry in Mesopotamia took place in these temples. And the story is like the temples would take in needy people, which was usually women and children.
Widows and orphans, or refugees, or
yeah, they would be brought into the temple and housed and fed, and they also had to produce these textiles while they were there, or like that was part of the life of the temple that they were part of, and that like originally it seems like these people who were taken in, the widows and the orphans and stuff, had kind of a high status as like servants of the goddess or something, like attendants to the goddess, whatever. But then eventually you see their status degrade and their living conditions got worse, and that coincides partially with the Sumerian culture becoming more warlike, and then also like captured people would also be brought to work in the temple too. So there's a bunch of history there where what the Davids are tracking, because they're very concerned with caring relations and how power and domination relations are mixed up in the Eurasian tradition, at least, with caring relations. And they have like a theory that's embryonic in this book, but I think that they were hoping to spend more time on, that domination in a structural way kind of arose out of a perversion or a distortion of care and caring relations. And they have a couple examples in the conclusion here that are along these lines, and this is one of them. And that, what started as this very charitable taking in these people and giving them a good life and, some work to do and living in the temple and, the temple being kind of like the highest point of the city and all of this stuff, turns into something much more exploitative.
Right.
Where the conditions are worse, the status is worse. And they kind of are asking, like, why would a change like this happen? Does it have something to do with warfare? It's impossible to say, but we know there's something going on here. There's something important going on here. And maybe this is like the cynic in me, like maybe I'm being the type of anthropologist that they're in conflict with. But when I hear the story, I'm like, well, someone is benefiting from
their labor,
from the labor of these people. And so there's going to be an incentive. Whether people take up this incentive or not is another question, but there's going to be an incentive to intensify the exploitation of the people. Right. And one thing that benefits the intensification of someone's exploitation, of exploiting somebody's labor, is to lower their status.
Right. Yeah, the more vulnerable someone is.
The more vulnerable, the more degraded somebody is, the more ill is spoken of them. All of these things, the more exploitation you can get away with. Right. And that is why I thought of immigration in the United States in this context, because it is false. It is a lie that the ruling class of the United States does not want poor, undocumented immigrants coming in to this country. They need and desire those people to exploit their labor. And it's beneficial for the ruling class that those people be very vulnerable and have no rights and have no guarantee of like a minimum wage or workers' comp or even to be in the country at all.
And are even afraid to seek healthcare.
Yeah. So like there's no social contract handed to those people, you know, such as it is in America, which is not great even for citizens really, but, you know, so that they can be hyper exploited. Right. And so, I mean, this is part of the reason why Trump has had like a lukewarm relationship with the ruling class, because sometimes he makes it sound like he really does want to close the border.
Right.
You know, and they're like, no. You know, like you can say stuff, but you can't do stuff, right? Because we actually need this flow of hyper exploitable labor, right? So the labor needs to come in, but their status needs to stay low, right? So anyway, I had this in mind as I was thinking about the Sumerian example here, because, I mean, I don't have any proof that it was so that people could get wealthy or get more power by increasing the exploitation of this labor, but that is a possibility that presents itself immediately to me.
Right. Yeah, it's not hard to imagine. When I first read that part, I was definitely like, well, I can think of a reason why this would have happened.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because there are people who stand to benefit from that. Yeah. It feels pretty direct. And it's not, you know, the fact that there even were needy people speaks to the fact that there was already some level of disproportionate amount of resources.
Yeah,
you know?
right. Yeah, right. Yeah, like are there pre-existing power differentials?
Yes.
Inequalities, like wealth differentials or something, and of what consequence were they? You know, but when I have questions like this, I'm like, well, would the Davids think I'm Hobbesian? Because I'm assuming that there would be a person who's looking to enrich themselves over the backs of, you know what I mean? It's kind of, I don't know, it gets complicated there. Like I do start to question myself.
I mean, I feel like you can say that like, if there's 50 people, there might be a couple of jerks in there without saying humans are selfish and greedy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, yes. And that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Is that like, I don't assume that everybody is like that, but I assume that if there's an opening for somebody who is willing to be like that, then someone will emerge who will go and exploit that opening.
And there's ample evidence that those people existed in Sumeria.
Yeah, right. But I totally understand that, like, to conclude that that was the case, we have to go and show that that's the case. Right. You know, I'm not saying that we should take it for granted that this is what happened, like inevitable slippery slope of labor exploitation or something. But I do think it's like telling about the Davids' overall strategy of the book that they choose to like leave out these things that might seem obvious to even to propose at least. To someone like you or me or whatever. Yeah.
Or most people.
And I think it's intentional.
Yeah, it's intentional.
I think that, because I think that they would maybe say that it's a slippery slope from that to, I don't know, to a Hobbesian view, to a
deterministic view.
To a deterministic
at least,
view.
Even if it's not Hobbesian, a deterministic view that, I mean, because, you know, just to say, like, even what I'm saying, if 1 out of 50 people, which I would say probably higher than that in my estimation, are people who will take advantage, who will exploit, who will seek to dominate. If those people exist, then are those people just going to win? Yeah. So maybe it is a slippery slope, but it might also be somewhat accurate.
Well, yeah, I mean, and maybe, well, this is an interesting thought experiment. I'm glad we're doing it. To use the Davids' own framework, they would maybe see that these people are vulnerable because they couldn't exercise the fundamental freedoms.
Yeah, because they can't leave.
Right? Because, so I don't think that the Davids would argue that these people are unfree.
Right.
But, we're trying to answer a different question, which is like, what is responsible for their change in status over time? But they were subject to a change in status that was going to determine their fate because, presumably they'd been taken in by the temple because they had no place else to go.
Right.
So the temple is maybe the hospitality of last resort or something.
Yeah, if you don't have kin to take you in. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so we already got into it a little bit, but maybe this is a place where we should try and summarize what the Davids are trying to say here about how we got stuck or what they're trying to think through. And it has to do with, as I said, the collision of care and domination, right? And the Sumerian temples is like a case study in that, but they have a more expansive story to tell about that.
Right. Yeah, their main other example, besides the Sumerian temple, is the Roman household, the patriarchal household that was the foundational unit in that society. Although the democracy, quote unquote, was made up of the patriarchs of the households.
Yeah.
But still, the social unit was the household.
Yes, right. The patriarchal, the household with a male
man at the top.
Yes.
Right? Dad, granddad, whatever he is.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works if you have more than one.
Very literally patriarchal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The pater familias.
Oh, yes. Yes. And that a lot of the law that we still have, property law and other parts of the civic code in many countries in the West still can be traced back to many of these laws in Rome and the language around them. What they're drawing attention to here is that the rights of these individuals, these citizens that were these patriarchs, is the right to do with whatever they want with their property, which included everyone in the house. All of the women, even their wife, their children, so young boys until they're adults too. Yeah. And all of their slaves. And Roman households were served by a pretty enormous staff. Right. It seems like in some cases, even smaller scale households might only have a few enslaved servants, but larger households might have hundreds. And so part of what they're trying to draw attention to here is that theoretically, that patriarch is caring for all of those people.
Yeah.
He is providing for family and servants who happen to be enslaved.
Their power and domination is framed as paternalistic care.
Right.
And they point out that domination comes from the same root as domicile and domestic.
So wild.
Right?
There's so many mind-boggling language.
Our language preserves this relationship between the domestic and the power relation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then they go on to talk about how later in Europe, the various monarchs would see themselves as the caretaker for all of their subjects.
Right.
As well.
Right. And we even had examples of this when we talked about some of the early Egyptian rulers.
Yes, that's
as
true.
well.
Right.
Who were like, I am such a great father to all my subjects or something. Like they would frame it in this way too. So this is a theme.
And I'm pretty sure that in Chinese dynastic history that is also the case. I think it's very common. And they bring up examples of this in Aztec history when they're citing Steiner's work at least. That there's various empires around the world.
Yeah,
in
right.
which the leader would see themselves as the great father to his people.
Yeah, and these are interesting points too, because if you just take the Roman Empire and then go downstream in history through the European experience, then, you could easily argue that Rome kind of set the template that was then just followed by all the rulers after it. Or even if you want to include the Egyptians, that the Greeks took from the Egyptians, which passed it on to the Romans or something, and all of this it's a theme in that part of the world because the cultures were very interconnected. But then once you start bringing in China, Aztec, not that there was no connection between these places, but it just to some greater degree suggests the possibility that framing goes deeper in some way than just being a historically contingent outgrowth of a specific culture and time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
it's not that big of a leap to think that once you have the patriarchal household as a feature of culture, that if a monarchy emerges, that the monarch could see himself as the patriarch of the whole people. That's not that big of a leap.
Right.
But we have to account for how we get the patriarchal household to begin with.
Yeah.
Too, and how like captured, enslaved people could be brought into this paradoxical relation of care and doting and power and subjugation.
Right. One thing I was also just thinking about is that
has something to do with war, I think.
Oh. Well, I was going to say that in the Roman Empire, this was not the case until much later in that history, but there was the paternal leader, political leader, but they had a polytheistic religious worldview. And there was not a paternalism with their pantheon, really. Zeus, sky god, is not your dad.
Right.
He doesn't really care for you like a dad. In fact, he might turn into an animal and rape you. Like, we don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
But the Abrahamic faiths have a very paternal monotheistic religion. The common thread with those faiths is the paternalistic father. Some of them have a son in them, some of them do not. But there are these other prophets, and sometimes those prophets themselves can have a paternalistic relationship with their congregations as well. Right. Often the believers are considered flocks that are being cared for by the shepherd. It's like a very daddy style.
I almost feel like the term patriarchy was almost coined to describe these cultures.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So I was just thinking about how when the Abrahamic faiths came along, and then eventually the Roman Empire converts to one of those. Christianity, specifically. Then we have like a marriage of two ways of thinking, which is social structure and religious structure, which are both paternalistic.
Yeah, that's all super interesting. And like the Davids don't venture that much by way of an explanation. Am I right? They're flirting with this idea that violence, that like when a culture is warlike with respect to others and outsiders, that has an impact on relations inside the culture. And that it's bad for women, and that it encourages these patriarchies at the domestic level, but they almost kind of comically are like, why could that be, when there's like a huge literature on this subject that they don't footnote or reference. But
I mean, Graeber's book Debt talks about this. Actually.
But they do bring this in as a possibility. But most of what they're trying to do is really just draw our attention to something getting mixed up. Some like wires getting crossed or something is almost the way they talk about it. Something got mixed up about care and power. And they sort of feel around for how this could be an understandable progression, where if you like take someone in to care for them, then they like owe you a debt almost. And so you have some power over them. And so it's like kind of understandable about how that could get abused in certain situations or whatever. I mean, I think they're kind of trying to talk about this, but over the longer span, they're talking about how domination gets like normalized as a form of care in specifically the European context is how they go on. And then they draw a really elucidating contrast between Wendat society at the time of European colonization and getting to know those people and French society
at the same time.
Right.
So then we're kind of like back with Candiaronk.
Or like the culture that Candiaronk came from.
Right. They talk again about the Jesuit records of their disbelief in the violence that they saw in the Wendat communities. And then we also have the record of the Wendat people going to Europe and being shocked at the violence in France.
Right.
And the difference there is that, or the difference that the Davids draw attention to, is that in the Wendat culture, violence was only committed against outsiders. And specifically in that culture, when there was war, it was usually like, they don't call it blood feud, but it feels like that to me. It's kind of like if somebody is killed, like one of your family warriors is killed or kidnapped, then a war party would go out and attack the other tribe. And then bring back captives. And those captives might be adopted into the community. It was up to the women to decide, actually. And sometimes it would be given the name of the person they lost, which is interesting.
Right.
But sometimes and it'd be often, those captives would be tortured publicly for days on end by the entire community. Children would participate, women would participate. I'm not going to describe the torture.
Until they were dead.
Until they were dead, yes.
Yeah. And the Jesuits were like shocked by all this. Like they're like, whoa. You know, so it's not that the Wendat people are just peaceful and don't have violence. No, they're very willing to inflict brutal violence against someone who they've captured who they're not going to adopt.
Right.
You know, but if they adopted somebody, no harm would come to them.
Right.
They would be doted on. They would just be completely adopted, right? But the line gets drawn at who's in and who's out, who's us and who's the other.
But the Jesuits also would talk about how the Wendat people were shocked at the suggestion of corporal punishment. They would be like, we're not going to beat our children.
Yeah, right.
That's absurd. You don't beat your own children.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so the Jesuits were confused by this. But then when the Wendat people would go and visit France to see what that was like, they would express horror and confusion at the violence they saw there, which was generally violence against poor people, criminals.
Yeah.
Who would be stealing food, probably public drunkenness, probably sex work, you know, all of the kinds of things that were illegal there that poor people do. And the Wendat were shocked because they were like, wait, you kill your own people? These people are just like
torturing,
you. You're torturing and kill your own people. So the contrast here, according to the Davids, is that the Wendat communities would do violence together against outsiders. But everyone, there was sort of a collective responsibility to discipline this outsider, and it drew the community together. Yeah. But then on the other side, the French people were united under vulnerability, at least the poor, to the violence of the king.
Yeah, and the way they kind of say this is that in Wendat society, care and violence were kept separate. You know, they're like, you don't do violence
to your people.
To people who you also are caring for. Right. You don't intermingle care and violence. You know, so to the extent that French society could be seen as one big culture of people who are supposed to care about one another because they're all French, then like it's shocking that they would be doing violence within that culture, you know, intermingled with care. So this is the David's point, is that somehow we who went wrong, you know, I mean, the we here is the European culture that they're talking about, but like in Europe, at least, because that's the most well-documented strand of this, we got care and violence mixed up. And they don't exactly leave it there, but they kind of do, you know, because this is the last chapter of the book. And they're not like, now we're going to spend 500 pages, you know, examining all of this and how that happened, but they're hinting towards what might be a more satisfactory explanation than the stuff that's been offered already that they've spent the book debunking. And presumably they wanted to work on it some more.
Yeah. That's a sad part.
Yeah. And I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about where an explanation like that would fit potentially into our understanding and trying to make sense of the world around us, but I'm not going to go into them. But I do think it's interesting that like this is what they bring forward, you know, and there is something very resonant there. I don't think that they're wrong to train the magnifying glass on this kind of confused
the access of care and violence
that exists in, you know, the culture I live in.
I keep thinking about how within like a corporal punishment context, you know, there's this phrase that the parents will say that's like, this is going to hurt me worse than it hurts you. Or something when they're actually perpetrating violence on a child who's much smaller than them. You know, and then being like, I'm actually the one getting hurt. Like, what kind of like mindfuckery is this, right? Even though I understand the sentiment kind of, I'm also just like, this is the culture we're talking about, where in which like I have to discipline you and it hurts me to do so.
Well, it's also just a guilt trip then.
Oh, absolutely.
At that point.
Right, both. I'm going to hurt you and it's your fault that I'm hurting.
Yeah.
Anyway, now I'm off topic, but I kept thinking about that and I even have it in my notes in the margins of the book.
But really, I think that the Davids would see the bigger achievement of this book as being the space that's opened up to even have alternative theories like this.
That's true.
Rather than the content of the theories themselves, which they have only sketched.
Right. Well, maybe I'll close off this episode with a quote from the book about what you're talking about.
Yeah, do that.
It's 2 paragraphs, so bear with me.
I'm ready.
Okay. Perhaps if our species does endure, and we one day look backwards from this as yet unknowable future, aspects of the remote past that now seem like anomalies, say bureaucracies that work on a community scale, cities governed by neighborhood councils, systems of government where women hold a preponderance of formal positions, or forms of land management based on caretaking rather than ownership and extraction, will seem like the really significant breakthroughs, and great stone pyramids or statues more like historical curiosities. What if we were to take that approach now and look at, say, Minoan Crete or Hopewell, not as random bumps on a road that leads inexorably to states and empires, but as alternative possibilities, roads not taken? After all, those things really did exist, even if our habitual ways of looking at the past seem designed to put them at the margins rather than at the center of things. Much of this book has been devoted to recalibrating those scales, to reminding us that people did actually live in those ways, often for many centuries, even millennia. In some ways, such a perspective might seem even more tragic than our standard narrative of civilization as the inevitable fall from grace. It means we could have been living under radically different conceptions of what human society is actually about. It means that mass enslavement, genocide, prison camps, even patriarchy or regimes of wage labor never had to happen. But on the other hand, it also suggests that, even now, the possibilities for human intervention are far greater than we're inclined to think.
That's great. Yay.
Until next time.
Until next time.